degree program of the Ateneo de Manila University and the University for Peace in Costa Rica. The Master in Transdisciplinary and Social Development is also being offered as a standalone degree program. I am Zarina Saloma Akpedonu, a professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and I teach SocDev 201.3. Thank you for joining us in this morning's conversations on COVID-19, birthed concepts and theories in social development. We are joined by graduate students, faculty, as well as the interested public. Please use the chat function on the right side of your screen for questions and comments related to the webinar at any time. And please state your name and affiliation with your comments and questions. In today's webinar format, we shall begin with a lecture, which will be followed by an interview to be run like a conversation. So let me now introduce our resource speakers. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mario J. Aguja, or Mayong, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology of the Mindanao State University, or MSU General Santos City. He holds a PhD in International Cooperation Studies from Nagoya University, an MA in Sociology from the University of the Philippines in Diliman, and an AB in Sociology from MSU General Santos City. He took up graduate studies in comparative economics culture with specialization in international economics and development studies at Sophia University. Mayong is currently the president of the Philippine Sociological Society, and this is a circle from where I know Mayong. But the hats he wears are many. In the mass movement, he is a street parliamentarian, and he was also the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Forum on Security Sector Governance in Southeast Asia. He was a member of the House of Representatives of the Philippine Congress from 2002 to 2007, and currently a member of the independent decommissioning body that oversees the decommissioning of combatants and weapons of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Now, let me also introduce a dear colleague at the Ateneo. Dr. Enrique Nino Leviste is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Ateneo de Manila University. He is also the director of the Institute of Philippine Culture and editor of the Philippine Sociological Review. He earned his PhD in sociology from the National University of Singapore and was a recipient of the Ananda Raja Prize for Best PhD Thesis in Sociology. He has taught undergraduate and graduate sociology courses in the Philippines and Singapore, and was a volunteer social studies teacher at the Lumad Bakwit School, a school for displaced indigenous peoples. Sociology of education and political sociology comprise his scholarly interest. His work has been published in cross-cultural case studies of teaching controversial issues, pathways and challenges to democratic citizenship education, Teacher's College Record, and the Philippine Sociological Review. So at this point, may I now ask you to join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Mario Aguja.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akpidono, for inviting me to join in your class. And of course, with Dr. Leviste, may my greetings of peace to all of you. Assalamu alaikum. I think there are a lot of Japanese students involved. Ohayo gozaimasu, wadika, and minglaba, and selamat pagi. It's interesting how we go through with the world today because we continue to interact with each other and learn from each other. I thank Ateneo for inviting me to share with you based on some of the reflections based on the theory I've read and the experiences I went through on the very question of development and in the question of peace. And probably using COVID as a very good example for all of us to ponder on the very question of development. may I just share with you a little PowerPoint that I prepared? I hope the organizers will not mind. Uh, just to capture and frame, hopefully in a limited time, my discussions then before we go on conversations today. As I was informed by Dr. Saloma, that this an international discussion with students coming from different experiences. What could I do is probably to share the experiences that I have been through, and probably taking root also from the Philippine experience, but also in the Southeast Asian region, and engage you in a conversation later as we walk through with the issue of development. While we have general theories on development, the application of these theories are always dependent on the situations on the ground. That's why we always say that development students, at the end of the day, what you learn, you go back to your roots. You go back to people, because the meaning of development is nothing unless people are there. But as a sociologist, let me bring you to the little world we have in sociology. We are in a field that always believe, and rightly so, that we are all social beings, and all social beings, we live in a socially imagined life. We could not imagine life as mere individuals, but rather we imagine life as individuals in relation to others always. You probably have heard the traditional saying we have, that no man is an island. People cannot survive by themselves unless they are with others. Or the saying, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. Who you are is a reflection of the society or the group where you are coming from. And we as individuals have all the potentials. In fact, Karl Marx spent his early days basically looking at the human potentials and what limits the blooming of human potentials. And Marx should have told us that through labor, which means our interaction with nature, anything outside of us, to produce goods or products or services or relationships, we develop our humanness. But again, that is the young Marx. The old Marx would always tell us that the social structures, especially the structure of capitalism, destroyed that humanness in us, and therefore limits the development of potentials of people. We live in a web of social life. The way we introduce ourselves, we always make reference to our families. That's why we use the family name. When we introduce ourselves, we tell people where we are coming from, whether we are Filipino, whether we are Cebuano, whether we are Japanese, because we are part of those society. We introduce also, when we introduce ourselves, we also introduce the religion that we have sometimes, or the school where we came from, like in your case, or the general communities we are coming from, coming from Tokyo, coming from Thailand or Jakarta, or the profession we are in, development workers and others that you are doing. We don't generally introduce ourselves, our own just being a person, vital statistics, your weight, we don't. Generally, we introduce ourselves in relation to the social groups where we are coming from. And in the social groups we are coming from, there are rules, there are expectations, there are obligations, there are awards, and there are punishments as well. Because to be part of the group is to communicate with a group and to share that what we call commonness that brings us common. And therefore, while we are individual shaped by time, by the respective groups that we are part of. And that makes our life what we are today. And I think the issue of development, therefore, depends. What happens to the individual depends on the social relations or in the web of social relation we are in. Therefore, it's important to investigate how our conditions affect actually our relations with others affect ourselves, because at the end of the day, we cannot isolate ourselves from others. And given that one, we basically have, before I go, then we go to the question of we are in a crisis. Of course, COVID is just one of the triggers of a crisis. It is an epidemiological trigger of the crisis. But it could be any other thing. At the end of the day, it's the same. We are in crisis. Uh, it might have been caused by an earthquake. It might have been caused by a natural phenomenon, or it might have been caused by conflict. So how do we exactly define a crisis? Whatever the trigger is. From a sociological point of view, because of these social relations that we have, we imbibe in ourselves what we call values. Now, determines what is important to us. And therefore, what we do is always determined by the concept of values. And sometimes it's either the normative one. It means to say, because we are taught we should do it, then we do it regularly. Or because on certain moral grounds. That, this is not just about being important. This is also a moral question for many of us. Is this the right thing? So all those values shape ourselves and the way we interact with people every day, and the way we do things, and the way things becomes good for us or that makes us happy, because these things are aligned with aligned with the values that we've learned. No. So those values are very, very important, in our daily understanding of others and ourselves. That's why we need to go back on that, because crisis is basically a situation when our values are challenged, our values are in conflict, or we are at loss because our values don't work anymore. Then that makes the crisis. Unless we're able to develop alternatives and be resilient to respond to the condition, then we are in a condition of crisis. And there are important values for us. These are all related to the current discourse on COVID, for example. In the COVID, for example, we are told to do things that we are not used to do. No. We have a value for life. Life is important for us. We also value livelihood. People has to work, earn a living. They could not just be stuck in their household doing nothing, because every time that they are not out there, there's always the possibility that their family were not able to have a meal at the end of the day. We were taught to do physical distancing. But for many, people are blamed for being hard-headed for not following physical distancing. But you could imagine, from elementary, we were told that you have to be with people, you shake hands, you hug, you do beso-beso or kiss with people. We are always told that from elementary up to today that these are good things for us to do, and we always feel good doing it. Then eventually we cannot do it anymore, or we are not allowed to do it. Then we have that crisis in ourselves. No, that's why while it's unfortunate that people that violates whatever rules they have on lockdown, for example, are the very people that process within themselves, what are the risks that they can afford to take if only to pursue their values. Like, for example, the value of feeding a family every day. Unless alternatives are provided during the lockdown, where families are provided of what they need, then people don't just do things because they like to just do it. but rather, more often than not, it is oriented to the values that they have. Their values tell them exactly whether they should be risk taker or not. So that's where values plays an important role. So we got a problem of physical distancing. We got a problem of people not wearing masks. I'm sure it's also true from the communities where you came from that people don't even, some people, if not some, many people did not even have the experience of wearing the mask, no, the face mask. You go to indigenous communities, these are strange things. No, then suddenly when they go down, they were asked to wear a mask. One, they do not know why we need a mask. Second, you see a lot of people don't even use the mask properly, and we don't blame them because it's not part of our values of what is considered important to us. It's probably different in the case of a Japanese society, where in Japan it's common to have a mask. You know, every time you're sneezing, it becomes standard operating procedure that somebody wears a mask. But in many societies where we live, mask is a strange, wearing a mask is a strange thing, as well as availability of masks, especially at the height of the crisis, is nowhere to be found. And yet people are blamed for not following the rules. That's very unfortunate. So there are many things. People are not allowed to go to church. So we close all the churches. But many people have lived through the years, every week, every Sunday to go to church. The feeling of freedom and peace is there. I could not imagine how do you say and offer your sign of peace during the Mass when you are doing it online or where you are having your Mass on radio. Because faith, religion is not just about faith. It is also a community of faithfuls. It is where the rituals and practices responds to needs of individuals on a regular basis. So given that, the crisis is basically epidemiological in nature, but our response to the crisis develop a further crisis. In fact, one of the things that the crisis caused by COVID opened up was basically the social fault line that we have in our society. For many communities, you will see how different is life during the lockdown, during COVID, for people who have better lives, a better social class, and for those who have to live on a day-to-day basis just for their family to survive. I think the crisis have highlighted that one. For a family that has jobs, that has a good home, that has all the resources, living during the lockdown seemed to be tolerable. You can live in your air-conditioned house for the whole day, have access to the internet, go to Netflix, and go to Netflix and watch a Korean novela to the end of the day, order delivery food. That's perfect. It's a good vacation, and you still receive your salary without going to work. But for many people, for those who are in the margins of our society, life becomes unbearable. Without going out for a day means a lot of things for the survival of their family. For being stuck up in a home that is even too small for humans. No, the mausoleum of the rich, for example, are in fact better than many of the houses of people, for example, in informal settlements. So staying at home for the whole day is an unbearable thing. And people were not even allowed to, if you happen to be going through an informal settlement, people go home, enter inside their house either to eat, but sometimes they even eat outside, or people go inside their house just to sleep. Because generally, all the things that they do in life is done in the streets or in open spaces in the communities, because the what we call home cannot just provide that necessary space for individuals or for any families. So that's a lot of horrible thing. This is notwithstanding that for the Filipinos, our the favorite TV station of the masa who broadcast freely available to the poor had been shut down, you know, and they had been deprived of whatever little entertainment that they could have during the time of the lockdown and the time of the crisis. So these are fundamental things that has not been considered in our response to the crisis. We were told, for example, I think there was a very good example that the for those who are familiar with the Philippines, for example, the local government of Cebu had been saying, you know, you can probably go tuob, you know, steam inhalation that might probably help you, and many people did, despite whatever scientific evidence to the contrary. Why? Many of our people will die without seeing a doctor, so you don't tell them how it is to avail of medical attention from a doctor or a hospital. What they know, based on their lived experiences, all these traditional healing and others work for their own interest. And that is the only experience that they have probably in life. So we could not judge people, you know, for being so hard-headed, you know, not following rules and etc. Because at the first place, we have not entered into the lived experiences of people and use those lived experiences to empower people so that they will be able to engage in our effort to protect our communities. So how did we respond generally to COVID? In general, what we did first and immediately the moment we learned that it happened in China, in Wuhan, then we deglobalized. We locked down airports, seaports, we closed down everything, locked down ourselves as a country. The national government takes power in many situations. We have not used, in fact, the crisis also show the limitations of our international organization to respond. No? The United Nations, the WHO, the European Union, the ASEAN were not able to mobilize themselves and collectively work together to find a solution to the problem. It's a survival of the fittest. So each country have to do your own if you like to survive during the crisis. That is during the height of the crisis. I don't even know if the vaccine will be discovered soon, how it will be shared by the countries that were able to discover it. Will it be shared in the spirit of solidarity because people needs it, or will it be shared for economic reasons, for a fee? So we deglobalize, and international solidarity is lost. No? We cannot even send easily now, for example, if we want to provide assistance to people in Africa who had been affected by the crisis, you cannot easily do that. Mechanisms are not working, you know. United Nations agencies generally halt their work, and the movements of those goods become so difficult. So while we hate globalization for its inability to develop our humanness, globalization remains an open arena for global solidarity, because it was neoliberal globalization that has been dominant today, but globalization as a concept of people moving and goods and services had been there through the years. Then other one is basically at the national level, governments centralize themselves. This is, I think, for those who are involved in development work, for those involved in the development work, we always say that, you know, the more we decentralize government, the more we touch down with people, the more we listen to people, the more people participates in process and other processes in their communities, the better it is for the people, the better it is for development. But through laws, for example, the national government took over of almost everything in determining who will lock down, what to do during the lockdown, and other things. That's why in many communities, there were complaints, so many complaints, for example, from local government units and local authorities that they were not given the opportunity actually to shape how to effectively respond to the crisis. Because at the end of the day, this is their communities. But suddenly, there was a commanding height of the central government, and people were not given opportunity to participate. No. I have not heard, community meetings or forum that were called where people were asked how best to respond to the COVID crisis. So at the end of the day, what we know is instructions were broadcast. You cannot do this, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, without even rationalizing it to people why they should or could not do it. And that explains why you have violations. Violations not because people just like to oppose the rules, but violations because it has not, those instructions are not synced or delivered in relation to the lived experiences of our communities. Third, we securitize our response. I'm not sure. Every time we have a crisis, we basically securitize it. It means to say we mobilize the security forces, the armed forces, the police. But at the same time, we even use the logic and jargon that they have. Lockdown, checkpoints, person under investigation. These are very martial concepts. While I have nothing against generally with people in the security service, but what I have, they are trained in a different way and not on a conditions like this. They might have been trained in counterinsurgency, for example. They might have been trained to do law and order. But this issue is not a law and order issue. This is a social issue, and therefore, the more important that we should start mobilizing people and find collectively what are the solutions based on the nature of their communities. We have not done that one. We have securitized it. We had the Marshall Plan, everything that has been militarized. While the military might have logistics, but it doesn't mean that they have that ability to run all these things. It saddens me to see an armored tank, stationed in a community because there's a lockdown. There could have been a better way of doing it. So how do we call all this crisis? They don't call it a COVID crisis. They call it a war on COVID. It's a war. No? And I see, okay. So in the concept of war, the rule is always just to eliminate the enemy. And unfortunately now, we know the enemy, and we also know how to eliminate COVID. To eliminate COVID is to have a vaccine. But without that vaccine now, how do you go through with a crisis? You need the people in there. In many of our lives, in many crises of our communities, we mobilize people, we mobilize groups. In this case, only the security sector was mobilized. In fact, we stretched them. I talked with many of them. They're not happy. They tell us that, they've been on duties, risking themselves, leaving their families, stretching themselves too much because there were very few of them. And yet we have not mobilized organizations and groups in the communities that perfectly deliver results in the past. I could only imagine of religious groups, for example, the women's group in the community, the civil society groups who had been there in the community. I don't think that there is nothing that they could do to help. Because if you talk to them, exactly they know how to contribute to ease the crisis for many of our people, but at the same time, without endangering public health. So that's a problem with securitization because we always think in terms of war. And in terms of war, we always look at the mighty, and community organizations and groups are not always considered the mighty ones. But at the end of the day, when you go down to communities, they know better these people and these organizations because our communities had been with these groups for the longest time. And there is really high level of trust. So we miss the opportunity for social mobilization to respond to the crisis. Third, this crisis is based on fear. People were threatened that if we don't do this, if we don't do that, then we might as well just die. And, it's a pandemic. Fully agree. But where is science in there? Because in many of the policies we did, we don't find any logic based on a scientific perspective. Look at now. In the case of the Philippines, for example, we had a lockdown when the number of infection was very low. In fact, in my city, we're happy to say that during the lockdown, we did not have an infection. And yet, we lifted all the lockdowns because the economy was suffering, the people's needs were not responded. We opened up the lockdown at the height of the infection. Where is logic there? Then of so many things that we do on the ground, while we lock down an entire city, where in fact we could just lock down an entire street. So, and yet fear was used. And in fact, we were told at certain point, if you don't follow the rules, then the police could just shut you down. So there's a problem with fear. While it's understandable that we have to make people understand the fear, but people cannot live with their fears every day. There must be a scientific or a logical basis for our fears. Then it's where people act effectively. Then many of our policies, unfortunately, are gender blind. Not only gender, but this is blind for those who are with problems in our society. We have not taken care, for example, of the needs of women, especially elderly women. You don't see it in any plans, where in fact the needs, we always say that there are differences in the needs of men and women in the community. I still have to see, for example, during the lockdown, you might have received packages, food packs, etc., and other things. This has been a discourse with us in the humanitarian communities here in Mindanao, that we said that, we have to factor in whatever packages we deliver to communities, the needs of women, from hygiene and sanitation things and other things that are specifically needed by women, which during the lockdown, it might not be available in any stores where they could buy. Like, for example, sanitary napkins. Those were not factored in many of the construction of policies, and therefore further marginalize or make life more difficult for many of our women in the community. Then for those in the peace building, the other lens that we could use is basically the lens of human security. If you like to measure all our responses, whether these are, in the human security, freedom from want and freedom from fear. How this initiative respond to that? For using a peace building lens where we talk of positive peace and negative peace, does it eliminate violent conflict, but at the same time, does it contribute to the issue of social justice? For now, Using these lenses may give us a good opportunity to go through what went wrong with what we are doing with COVID-19 and in general with development. Because at the end of the day, community should be while crisis may emerge anytime, our response to the crisis should help people deal with the crisis. In many instances today, our responses to the crisis does not help people to deal with a crisis. It brings unimaginable sufferings to many people. I could imagine that we had a lockdown, for example, in our community. On the first day of the lockdown, late in the afternoon, there was a guy who passed by in front of our gate. And the guy was asking, "Sir, could we ask for a kilo of rice?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I cannot go to work today." And he said, "If I don't earn today, then there's nothing to feed for my family." How many families are in that kind of situation in the different communities that we work with? And what we have given them an assistance for after a month, after a week. That's not even enough to fill in the regular minimum needs of these communities and families. So there's a lot of rethinking. And I think COVID opens, in a way, an opportunity for us to rethink how we respond to crisis, but at the same time, how do we go back to the question of development? Because if people, remember, people are affected by the crisis differently because of their social class, because of their social standing. So, what is our possible journey then? And I think people have talked of the new normal, which is not normal. For many of our people, it is full of social inequalities, it's full of oppression and human rights violation. And we are told to live in a new normal, which is neither new and definitely not normal for many of our people. But I think the struggle for many of us is basically to use the opportunity to create a desirable normal, where we factor in how all the initiatives we are doing will contribute in building a just and a humane society. And for me, any conceptualization of development devoid of the essence of building a just and a humane society is not development worth pursuing. This goes back to the earlier question of development in the 70s, when the issue of development for whom was raised. And that document in 1974, issued by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, became the working paper when the United Nations held an extra summit on development in 1975 because of the global crisis. So these are the challenges that we have today. And today, we have an agenda basically available. I think there's still a workable agenda at the minimum, and it's worth pursuing. It's only a matter how do we pursue it and push it in the discourse and inspire people how important this development paradigm is all about. Let me not bother you discussing the 17, but what I would like to share is there is a pyramid of that 17. At the top of the pyramid is their spiritual thing. And the spiritual thing talks of peace and talks of governance and talks of solidarity. This is what we need during this time of the crisis. Then on top of that, the next foundation is basically to build our ecological platform. Then the rest will follow. I think it is a very good sequence to follow through in our pursuit of development, because they are all interrelated. So if you relate in this platform, all of them are related actually to the spiritual side, then down the line are all related to the ecological side as well. So the crisis is with us. It will be there for some time. We do not know when it will end, but definitely it will come to an end. The only problem, the longer it takes, the more people will suffer. As a student of development, and one has journeyed with development for quite some time, I'm always asked, what is the bottom line for development if we like to measure development? To my mind, and based on experience, if you want to know development or there is development in the community, you look at our children. You look at the children of our communities. Why? Because they are the most vulnerable, but they are also the one that will bring promise to our society. They are the one that will build communities in the days to come. So always looking at children. And that's why we always say, even in our age, we are children of the world. Because it is through these lenses, by looking at the condition of our children, that will tell us the kind of social relations that's happening in our communities and the kind of developments that is happening around. I end up my note on that. I hope I have shared with the little time that has been given to me. And again, as sociologists, we always say when we try to understand the world we are in, we always have to develop or think sociologically, and we call it sociological imagination. A sociological imagination is where you put together your personal lives and experiences and that of what is happening to our society. Because at the end of the day, what is happening to you is a reflection of what is happening at the same time in the greater society where we live. I end up on that note. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to join again this conversation with Nino and with you. Thank you very much. Alaikum masalam. You are mute, Nino.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aguja. It's a pleasure to share this stage with you, so to speak, and to converse, regarding issues that remain prevalent in the context of the ongoing pandemic. And based on the insights that you shared with us a while ago, let me just bounce off quickly from them and probably push the envelope further as far as our conversation goes. So based on the insights that you shared, which I find fascinating, number one, it's good to reiterate the reality that development has always been a global project. And if I were to relate that to your closing statement a while ago, that as sociologists, we often attempt to exercise or to use our sociological imagination to see things in a more nuanced and more milieu-sensitive way, I guess that would be an apt starting point as far as our conversation goes, because as far as development is concerned, development has somehow connected us regardless of our cultural differences, regardless of our social class distinctions and whatnot. But it is also important to highlight that development has not really homogenized societies in the global sense. Although there are attempts to homogenize, right? Particularly with efforts coming from the global north, we also see that development has uncovered a multiplicity of experiences, as you mentioned, a diversity of agendas and narratives. Now, to push the envelope further, perhaps it would be good, Dr. Aguja, to further shed light on how, in the context of crisis situations such as this, vis-a-vis development initiatives and paradigms, how has the ongoing pandemic, how has COVID-19, as you've experienced it, in Mindanao particularly, how has it, number one, revealed the merits of our current development plans and paradigms? But at the same time, how has it revealed or uncovered the inadequacies or the weaknesses of our development paradigms and plans? It could be a good starting point for us, Dr. Aguja.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doc Nino. Very indeed important questions to be raised today. Let me just go on the homogenized thing. While we would like everybody to enjoy life, you know, and as peace educators, we always agree that diversity is necessary. The colorful life should be necessary, but it doesn't mean that we should have a diversity of access to resources and privileges in life. I think we should even that one. Then diversity goes on natural talents, perspectives and cultures of people, but not diversity in terms of the rich and poor. I think that's not where the concept of diversity started. Yeah. While many societies have plans, development plans, the COVID crisis shows us our inadequacy of those plans, because those plans were never thought nor designed to respond to the crisis. So for in the case of the Philippines, for example, we technically downgraded all those plans today because government have rationalized expenditure and therefore cut off the budget from the different agencies, for example, to put it in our COVID response, which either be a populist response, but many of the development plans are basically at halt. Basically at halt because of the crisis we have. You cannot just do it and deliver it just like normal times. And I think in development planning, this is where we always say that we develop the contingency. Remember, the plans are merely guide for us. But at the end of the day, plans could be changed anytime because the situation or the basic assumptions of the plans change. And it tells us the inadequacy in our planning process, because at the end of the day, what are the fundamentals that we would like to sustain? Health? I'm not sure. We would like to build a middle-class society, for example, in the case of the Philippines. I think the crisis have stole that plan already as of this year. And not only this year, but in the coming year, because you have not collected taxes, people did not have jobs, no one's paying, or very few are paying taxes, including business, then it means to say you don't have enough money to do your development work next year. And I think for all of those who are in this discourse is to look, what does it mean next year? How do we finance development? Development costs money. And I think there is now again a propensity to do borrowing. And the next question on borrowing, what are the terms and conditions on those borrowing? Is there the usual commercial terms, or this is a COVID crisis terms and conditions for borrowing? Because countries don't have money. They spend already for COVID, or even if they have not spent on COVID, they have not, business is not running, therefore there are no taxes that we expect that we can use for next year. So I think I agree there are those that says everything that we plan, while we assume the normalcy of things, we always assume contingencies in our planning. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Aguja. I think there are two points that merit reiteration from what you said. Very important, very poignant, if I may. Number one, you mentioned that it is important that our plans are grounded on everyday realities, and that these everyday realities further reflect the diversity of situations or conditions we find ourselves in. And hence, contingencies are important. So you emphasize on that quite eloquently. Number two, it's also important to point out, as you mentioned, moving forward, that these plans have to be flexible enough to accommodate situations that further heighten uncertainties. And you mentioned this in your presentation a while ago. So using that as our takeoff point, probably, to our next question, Dr. Aguja, why is there seemingly, a penchant a general penchant to emphasize on the security dimension, no? Not to diminish the importance of security, because personally I believe that there are two crucial values for human existence. No, freedom is one, no, freedom to assert, freedom to do what you like, but at the same time, security, which is certainty, no, freedom from insecurity and freedom from uncertainty. That's why you need security. But why is there, in your opinion, and based on your experience, why is there a penchant or a tendency to emphasize on the security dimension, knowing for a fact, as you mentioned, that there are other aspects of the pandemic that have to be addressed?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nino. It's really a very interesting thing to ponder on. I may not have the complete answer to that, but initially now what I say, this is all product of machismo. Strong men, strong guys who like to be in control with things. Because if you look now, many of the effective initiatives against COVID were done basically by women leaders who has that nurturing mind, that thinks of communities of people rather than thinking of war. But in many countries where you have leaders who are so macho, you have Trump, you have our own and other countries, then the tendency is always to show that power of the men. And the power of the men are often identified is through the barrel of the gun. Then it's where your security forces gets into the picture. Could you just imagine if all the people, for example, running the government or the task force on COVID and whatever countries you're coming from are dominated by women, there might have been a big difference in the approach. Because I think that default thinking was always a nurturing one as a mother, thinking of the needs of women, for example, why we can empathize with women, as part of the global movement and solidarity with women. It's still, we cannot assume the womenness that women have. And that is what is necessary for this particular thing. That's why we give praise, for example, women leaders in the world that were able to do respectable programs, despite hardship in dealing with COVID. So it's a sense of machismo. Minsan yabang, gustong pakita na, hindi, eto yan, I am in command of things, rather than to show empathy and sympathy to the different kinds of people, to the victims, and to our different communities. That could be the initial thesis that I could develop, Nino. I think research will probably help us on that in the coming days, but I think it's a food for thought. But there are many narratives in many of our communities, how different, the difference that women always make not on regular conditions, especially on difficult conditions. Thank you.
Okay. Well said, Dr. Aguha. And in line with that, since you mentioned the role of government, you tangentially touched on the role of government. And in crisis situations such as these, how can we move forward? How can governments evolve? Or do you think they are ready to evolve as far as addressing in a rather multidisciplinary or multidimensional way this pandemic? What do you think?
Yeah. Talking of government, as citizen in any countries, we always give government authority. There are people of authority, there are institutions of authority. Because we give them authority, because at the same time we give them mandates. When they do the mandates, we allow them to go on with the authority undisturbed. Like in the case of the Philippines, when you go back to the Philippine Constitution, it says in the preambular part, to build a society, to build a government that shall embody our ideals, to build a just and a humane society. So we give them the mandate, do it, build a just and humane society, we will not interrupt with you. But when government fails to perform the mandate, our social contract with them, I think the option for government is really to go back to the people and ask how exactly we can navigate in this crisis. No one has the monopoly of knowledge. We all agree with that. But at the end of the day, whether we had the right knowledge or we don't have the right knowledge, it has our decision has impact on the very lives of people down there. Then I think it's worth asking people down there, what do they think? How best we could navigate if government is run out of idea exactly how to go about it. Then I think in the development work, time and again, we go back again to the concept of good governance. And sa akin kasi ninyo, good governance, maraming elements, no? But there is one fundamental element of good governance that without it, you don't call it good governance. And that is participation. Without participation, no one knows what's going on. So there's no transparency. Because there's no participation, there's no rule of law. So all the pillars of governance will collapse without participation. And yet, it becomes a habit, either by sheer arrogance, not to listen to people, not to ask people the right questions when people knows the right answer, I think. Because when you go to communities, I have a radio program. When we talk with people, it's amazing. They have a science of their own on how to navigate and what best to do. No, they could tell you different ways of doing a mask, a face mask, because it's not available, that still feel safe about it. So we have not capitalized on that. And I think time and again is to tell government, participation is necessary because it's only through participation that we will be able to evolve strategies that respond to the specific needs of our different communities. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aguha. So you mentioned participation. So at this juncture, let's make this conversation, shall we say, more participative. And we call on Dr. Saloma Akpedunu once again and extend the conversation to our participants, not the students, and to our viewers. We would be happy to communicate or to answer concerns or questions or clarifications that you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nino. Thank you, Mayong. So at this point, I'll join in the conversation. I have a question here, the question about government that Nino earlier posed. How does the COVID-19, this is from Mark Anthony Articulo, how does the COVID-19 and the national government's responses to it affect the ongoing peace building in the Bangsamoro, including the process of decommissioning? Do you see this crisis as a threat to the effectivity of the newly constituted Bangsamoro Transition Authority?
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that one. I had a very interesting conversation last week with friends in the international. And the claims of really and resentment of many of the peace builders around the world is because peace builders were not considered frontline services. No. So it has an impact in the current peace building process, basically, because when there's conflict, as we know in Mindanao, even at the height of the COVID, there were conflicts that were going on in different communities. You cannot dispatch negotiators, peacemakers in the area to help ease up the tension in the area because different areas were under close lockdown. But in the peace process between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, we are taking a slow thing nowadays because the different mechanisms in the peace process were not able to do their work because of the pandemic. For example, there's a need to do dialogues with communities as to how to transform the different camps of the MILF to affliging communities. That cannot be done because of the lockdown. Development workers cannot go down. Communities are not allowed to get together. And you cannot do also a Zoom conversation with them. A Zoom conversation is a privilege. It's a privilege that you have the technology and you have the connection. In those areas, even if you have the equipment, in many areas where we had conflict, It's really difficult to find the signal. So that now delays the entire process. Good for us that we have already second one phase of the decommissioning just at the first week of March. We are actually to start the second phase of the decommissioning, but we cannot do it because in the decommissioning, you gather combatants, communities, then just no way of doing it. So the impact of it, what has been promised under the peace agreement are not fully delivered in the different communities. It's being delayed because you cannot do activities down there. And hopefully that when condition gets better, we can find options, it can resume. And I assume hopefully that money will still be there to finance it. No? Because if you remember, the government through the Bayanihan Law slashed the funding of all government agencies by 30%. And the president declared publicly that we don't have money. We have to look for money. And peace processes requires money. So that's one. So what does it mean? It means for now that it might delay the entire process. What we are trying to catch up is we're able to close the agreement, the closing of the agreement before the 2022 elections. But now nobody is certain and how to start it again, how to do the works in the different communities of the MILF and to bring development work, which is part of the agreement, remains uncertain as to today. No? So that's a clear implication of all of this as far as the peace process is concerned. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mayong. There is a question. You mentioned deglobalization earlier. And it's from an anonymous attendee. So let's, I think this is my student because the question cites a reading from my class on deglobalization. So how can COVID-19 open up the opportunity for a more globalized, sustainable civil society resiliency that can propose an alternative to neoliberalization without causing a side effect of, for instance, ultra-nationalism?
Yeah, that's good. Of course, we have to untangle the normal globalization we have, which is a neoliberal globalization. And I think in the different chat rooms and forums, there are now a lot of ongoing conversation actually how to build a global solidarity, taking advantage of the failure now of globalization as we know. And in many conversations, one is that this emerging is taking, because globalization, you don't just do it a global, because the national is linked to the global. It's the national that's pushing. And therefore, if the national changes, then the configuration of the global changes as well. Then people were saying, it's time to engage government in reshaping our participation in the global arena, which is basically defined by neoliberal economics. No? And that we have not factored in. I think this is always the debate we bring BOPIP at the WTO, when I was still sitting with our negotiators then, that we would like to make sure that our people benefits from globalization. No? But we allow the massive movements of goods and services, but not people. No? And I think building global solidarity is to allow as well this kind of movement. So I think that there is no fixed direction yet, but what is certain is there is ongoing with thinking that at the national society, at the level of a country, we help shape a more humane globalization. Because if we fail to do that, it will re-emerge, and in fact, probably the ultra-nationalists will take the lead on this because of our failure to engage. I think the word in there is we should engage the globalization, not only on the international, but actually at the local, trying to shape it as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for explaining that point. You made an earlier point about people focusing on people, and our concepts, meanings, definitions of development have evolved from economic understanding of development to the social understandings of development. Now I have a question from Duong Dang. This is a question regarding the SDG pyramid. And since all of our lives and economies depend on natural resources and natural cycle, if we prioritize social related goals over ecological goals, is there a possibility that we might sacrifice nature to address human short-term needs and in the end break the natural boundaries and cause collapse for all? Should we instead safeguard nature and follow its rules and take care of the people at the same time with equal attention?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I agree that it should be an equal attention because nature does not exist without humans. We develop the frame. But at the same time, humans are nothing when nature is not there. That's why when we go back to the concept of labor, at least that was developed during the time in the 18th and 19th century, especially by Marx, that we interact with nature for us to develop our humanness. We cannot just develop our humanness by just interacting with people. But people are part of nature in the greater conceptualization of Marx. And that includes the water, the air, so that we produce things that would be both beneficial. So I think when we talk of social relations, all these social relations are at the same time shaped by forces of nature. And it's important that we factor in that one, that, you know, the duality of existence of humans, that humans are not there without nature, but nature are also depend on human, either in the sense of meaning of what is nature, but at the same time in the sense of protecting nature, because without it, our survival will be a big problem. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay. That's a good point to make. We always emphasize the human, we always emphasize the social, which is indeed, of course, very much ignored in the discussion of development. But I think we also have to look at the ecology, we have to look at the humility of objects and space. They don't say anything, and yet they affect our lives. So thank you for that point.
Just to add, it's I think my bias is always to emphasize the value and importance of labor, because it's where you put all these things in perspective. You know, you labor for love, you labor for relationships, you labor for survival. It's all in labor, and therefore in labor, it's always interacting with things in nature. You know, because everything in nature has its own potentials, but it is only through the work of labor that we'll be able to maximize that potential and our own potential. Pero nawala kasi yung konsepto ng labor eh. Parang trabaho lang. Oo, no. When the meaning is deeper than that actually.
It is deeper indeed if we go back to Marx. The source of all value is our labor power, the labor. All right. But yeah, that labor connects very well to the idea and our interest in class on biographic navigation, the personal and social navigation. So that's very sociological from C. Wright Mills.
Sociological imagination.
That's right. So we have a question from Cecile Angela Ilagan. I find it was talking about you being a representative. So are there a former representative? Are there mechanisms in place to compel congressional representatives to aptly represent the needs of their constituents and penalize them if they do the opposite? How can participation in governance be actively practiced?
Yeah, how we wish it could easily be that. But, you know, this has been part of our political culture for the longest time. And this is actually our our greatest struggle, at least for the Filipinos, that today we have an elite democracy. It is a democracy that is reserved for the contestation of the elites. The poor people, those in the laylayan of our society, the chance of winning in the political battle remains to be very, very minimal in this country. Why? Because culturally, no, it starts a long years with the Spaniards. You know, when the Spaniards developed the elite class, the Principalia, you know, it all started being the host of sorry, I'm not so Catholic. Hermano Mayor, for example, during fiesta, it gives prestige to people for a certain group that could only have that. And that prestige develop in the psyche of our political leaders, many of our political leaders, is to get power for the sake of power and enjoying it for themselves. And the Americans, when they came, they developed a political system that is generally reserved for the elite in this country. And again, power was not used, or power is not to be taken for the service of the many, but for the interests of the political clans and families. So up to today, that is the kind of politics we have today. And therefore, many of these politicians we have don't have accountabilities. You know? And it's very difficult to account with them. And the problem, when these things had been there for the longest time, you know, it develops in the mind of our people that this is the normal thing. It develops a sense of normalcy. And especially when people are not only poor, but when people develop the culture of poverty because they had been in that situation for the longest time, then these things becomes normal, you know, and therefore changing it becomes very, very difficult. And I think it's where the discourse always in the literature that says that we need to develop a middle class. No, because a middle class is a class that can survive by itself without being holden to those in power for them to survive. But when the relationship of people and those in power are direct, it means a lot to survival, then questioning those in power becomes a very, very difficult endeavor. And it's where the question of development gets into the picture. That we try to develop people so that they can free themselves. They have the freedom with dignity to assert themselves. What this development is all about. Of course, people need not be middle class to do that, but that requires a lot, based on experience, that requires a lot of organizing work. No? That requires a lot of learning and practicing, for example, the pedagogy of the oppressed of Paulo Freire, to free people from that kind of oppression that they have lived in themselves. And that's a lot of work for us to do. So it could work at different levels. So while we do organizing in the communities, we push at the same time that the basics for people are improved in the community, health, education. No? We're not asking too much. No? We're not actually asking too much. These are basic. If education is provided, health is provided, and hopefully livelihood for people, then people start to develop themselves, then develop that critical thinking of engaging our political leaders. But for now, who cares? Politicians don't care with the voters because they know anyway at the end of the day, I can use my power, I can use my money, and can I always guarantee myself to win in an election with, in spite and despite of the masses. That's always our political problem in this country. And I think in many countries in Southeast Asia also. Okay.
Well, okay. Thank you, Mayong. So for both you, for you and Nino, there's a question about where you end despite of this the quality of our political participation. So on participation and civil society, what do you think of the civil society in general, at large, in relation to the response and the current political developments? Where does the the spotlight on the context of a more controlling state in the time of the pandemic figure in the non-mobilization of community-based organizations. Although some mimic the militaristic implementation of the lockdowns on their streets. So your assessment of civil society.
Yeah. But what happened with the lockdown? You know, in a conversations with many groups, many people like to go action. You know, especially of providing assistance for people that were directly affected by the lockdown economically. Don't have jobs, food, for example, and other things. That the only problem is they themselves have imbibed also that fear and caution, and knowing that there is a lockdown, that you are not essential. So you cannot move. There's very little they can do. No? Of course, there are those that are able to send masks, for example. But civil society in many of our communities can do more, because what they think is more than the mask. There was one group that I know of in the local that really pushed hard and find ways to deliver food packs, for example, to different poor communities. And this coming from trade unions. No? Because they know that when you are a tricycle driver, you know, you are a vendor of a balut out there, you can imagine what life is for these people. And they were able to do that, but it was a very difficult one. You know, generating the resources was difficult, the buying things, you know, and packing it off. But at the same time, delivering it has to be discreet. You know, and I think that affected many of our civil society. So there's still a need for civil society to do regrouping, because many of us, I think, in civil society have also missed this contingency planning thing. You know, what to do in times of crisis, because the way we operate, many civil societies operate on normal times, so-called normal times. But in abnormal times, then that lessens our flexibility to engage. It was only lately that there were consolidations of civil society and engagement, because in the midst of the pandemic, there was the passage of the anti-terror law. That civil society thinks we have to do and develop creative ways, no, for social action. And I think we saw the creative ways of social action, but it's not yet done at many communities, because many communities, the thinking of civil society and even church is basically how to provide the basic assistance to many of our people. No, that's a primary concern as of today. Thank you.
I think Bo Peep, if I may add, no, if I may bounce off from Dr. Aguha's insights, no, I think what the ongoing pandemic also uncovered is the diversity of responses that we get from secondary associations, more collectively known as, you know, civil society, and hence conceptually it will be a problem to think of civil society as a monolith. No, we see diversities in responses, we see diversity in terms of advocacies, and that's always a welcome development. But it is also, shall we say, problematic to treat civil society as if it has a single historical trajectory. Historically, we've seen civil society groups that have harbored anti-democratic tendencies, no? And so it would be good, or this is an opportunity for us as we are grappling and trying to address crisis situations, no? This is a good opportunity for us to revisit probably how civil society groups operate, what their roles, no, or functions in societies are. And it would also be good to observe how civil society groups, secondary associations, respond in a rather multidimensional way. To give you an example, perhaps, since Dr. Aguha mentioned women as a vulnerable group, a relatively vulnerable group that somehow has not been given attention as far as vis-a-vis this pandemic is concerned, no? And I think a good example would be the Lunas Collective, how Lunas Collective as a civil society arm, no, or a secondary association attempts to address issues of domestic violence, particularly during the time of COVID-19, because studies show how domestic violence has intensified amidst this crisis situation. So basically, the bottom line is to treat civil society as heterogeneous. No? It basically shows you how plural agendas are as far as development goes. It shows you how the narratives are diverse, and it shows you how projects are likewise multifarious.
Yeah. Just one point, Nino, and both people like to share. No, there's always a problem when the crisis lengthens itself. No, we are used to political crisis in this country. We are used to economic crisis. The only problem after those crises have been there for longest time, it has an impact to people. The problem I have to grapple with regularly in many discourses on social issues is not only how we dissect the issue, but how do we offer hope to people? Because seemingly there is now a crisis of hope. People have resigned, and many communities have already resigned, and they just believe, the only solution we have is patronage politics. So where is hope? And I think that's very, very important in the social construction of what we intend today. We offer hope to people because it is their number one enemy. And people say, there's nothing we can do because it's a national government, this is government, etc. We are powerless, and etc. It's not just offering the discourse of conscientization of Paulo Freire. But at the same time, in our discourses, we offer hope because it's our number one enemy for many people in our community. They had been stuck for this situation for the longest time. So the longer it takes, the lesser people are hopeful that through the exercise of their own individual powers, through the collectives, they will be able to shepherd a very ideal society or a better society that we'd like to do. I think for many of us, social scientists, development workers, and peace advocates, those are important things to be reminded all the time, that in our discourse, it's not only the problem, because sometimes when we do discourse, we do it to the full, the grim situation, and suddenly people say, so if that is the situation, then there's nothing much you can do because we failed to offer hope. No, thank you very much. Just to note.
Well, okay. Nino?
Oh yeah, I agree with Dr. Aguha, which actually made me think of citizenship education, because you mentioned, social construction, right? And knowledge, right? The dissemination, the construction, and the production of knowledge is crucial. And so perhaps a question to ponder in the future is, how do crisis situations affect citizenship education? There is such a thing as preparedness education, which is, I think, meant to address the lack or the dearth of education initiatives amid crisis situations. So something to ponder on, something to think about in the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nino. Thank you, Mayong. Maybe we'll have one more question here from Lorenzo Espacio, and I'll just combine this question from Justin C. There are some estimates, because we're talking about hope. There are estimates that this COVID pandemic will last for several years, and there seems to be no end in sight. In this regard, what do you think are the long-term impacts of this pandemic on our society and on our social values? And I must add to our understandings of culture and society, and connecting it with Justin C's question. Is the ideal future even attainable given the inescapable machinations of politics and power relations? So these are questions for both of you.
Oh, difficult questions. What's up? Well, I think what is certain now, the government is telling that we'll have an economic problem next year. We are going through a crisis now, economically. Politically, We have locked down many of the institutions that is part of our governance. We have centralized government, for example, and people's participation were taken out generally in many communities. So that would become part of the long-term crisis unless we try to innovate and arrest that one. On the cultural side, it will have very, very big impact to many of our people. And I'm very worried, actually, it has not been manifested today by many, uh, the issue of mental health. What does it mean to individuals? You have been taught all these years. You have to beso, especially as Filipinos, where we are touchy, we are warm, we like to be with bodies and others. Having been deprived of that for the last 4, 5, 6 months, will have an impact to individuals. No? And we will be doing, especially with many of our young people who will be doing their classes probably online or via mail. How do you adjust to that situation? No? It's not in our default system. Our system don't adjust immediately because you have to develop programs for that, to guide and help people navigate as individuals to this crisis. And that's what I'm worried, how it will manifest itself in the coming days. Because definitely the social institutions we have are still not functioning the way they should be. No, it's unfortunate, for example, the churches have already started saying mass last Sunday. But, there's always the fear that the police and others are there and watching them up, But for many people, it's a big relief that finally they can go through the mass. But other than that, where? The cultural community in the Philippines, for example, it's been our discussion with the National Commission for the Culture and Arts. Where is our cultural community now? Because I think they're the one that suffered a lot. They are not probably seen, they are not so many, but those involved in the cultural production were clearly affected by this. No? The singers, the artists, the dancers, the performers, that reminds us basically and gives energy to our social life. But they are not there. I love to go to a bar and listen to music. I used to do that at least twice a week before. But now I have not done that for probably for the last 3 or 4 months. No, because the bar closed. Because they cannot sustain themselves. So singers lost their jobs. So we are helping our community of artists in here. So those are the implications in the coming days. Even if we will already have, for example, the vaccine. Assuming we'll have a vaccine by December. But the impact of it in our lives from March to December will still be there in the following year. So really difficult to provide. But I think I agree with Nino. It's where we try to imagine how do we creatively do citizenship, active citizenship this time. Because this is what we also need. To put people online and actively engaged is to do active citizenship. But how do we do it given the current situation? I think that should be an interesting task for all of us in the coming days.
Okay. In my case, 2 points, Dr. Aguha. Number one, the COVID situation, as in any crisis situation, and if I may borrow Charles Tilly's term, reveals durable inequalities. Inequalities that have always been there. Inequalities that are not only economic in nature, as many of us might tend to think, but inequalities that also reveal its social, political, and cultural dimensions, right? And hence, the way we respond to these inequalities and the injustices that they bring should likewise be multifaceted and multi-tiered. A single response, a monolithic response, is not enough, is inadequate, in fact. And so in relation to that, and on to my second point, I think as educators, so we all belong to a scientific community. We are all teachers here, but at the same time, we are students of society. We're learners as well. I think it's crucial, and to borrow Henry Giroux's term, to promote what we might call a pedagogy of intervention. And this is bouncing off from Dr. Aguha's point as well. So in other words, our intention or objective is not only to understand how society works, which is indeed a dimension of sociology and anthropology, but given the new learnings and understandings that we call or that we derive from our own everyday experiences on the ground, perhaps it will give us sufficient insight into what we need to do next. And to do means to practice, no? To do means to implement something concrete, no? And I think teaching in the classroom or online should be conscious or should deliberately and systematically incorporate how we can intervene creatively and productively in the coming years or in the coming decades even, given the impact of this pandemic, which has created so much insecurity and so much uncertainty.
All right, thank you, Nino. Thank you, Mayong. Unfortunately, time is short. So I now have to really thank both of you for showing us and the class, my students, how to attend to the meaning of development in the particular context we now face the world over. Societies in crisis because of COVID-19, but not just because of COVID-19. The actual articulation of the crisis varies by national context and region of the world, as well as by families and communities. And as we learned in our readings, concepts and theories of development have to evolve over time to capture societal concerns, contexts, contestations. These evolving concepts and theories are the product of efforts of different groups in different social and geographic locations seeking to extend the promise of development. So this is what in your conversations what came out as citizenship or the expansion of citizens' rights, especially so that development will be accorded more closely to the experience of the excluded and the marginalized. Now, for us today, the question is, what does it mean to be a social development practitioner when the possibility that our responses to the crisis beget further crises? So Mayong, Dr. Aguha shows how COVID-19 challenges concepts that we are familiar in development field, globalization, human security, and peace building, and how the absence of people's participation, real people's participation in these responses highlight the importance of co-production of knowledge, co-ownership of benefits, and co-creation of capacities all the more. It highlights how much the world needs the problem-driven social scientist, how the world needs the development practitioner who is on a problem-solving mode. In class discussions on transdisciplinarity, we learn about the importance of asking the questions, knowledge for whom and knowledge for what. And from Michael Burawoy, we find some answers via his 4 types of knowledge. But policy knowledge, professional knowledge, critical knowledge, and public knowledge, and how in times of crisis, we might benefit from relying on public knowledge, which is the dialogue between the scholar and the non-academic public. And in the case of development work, the dialogue between the social development actor and their partners around societal goals and means for achieving these goals. So the crisis is an opportunity to abandon practices that did not work and to adopt new ways that hopefully would work. So we end with hope here. So thank you, Mayong, for spending your morning with us and the community at the Ateneo. Thank you also for Nino for being the conversation partner that Mayong needs to discuss changes and ways we can make our concepts and theories more apt to the situation. So I am Zarina Saloma Akpedonu of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again in our future activities. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.